Well, I'm Joe Brown. I'm an American, as you probably figured out. I'm a Southern American, you haven't figured that out. I've been involved in trying to measure treatment outcomes in big systems of care now for 20 some odd years, working with big insurance companies. I was making a decent living at it, but then as these things go, they didn't need me anymore. So a group was put together, what we call the Acorn Collaboration. We're able to get funding from some insurance companies early on and began to develop a new platform. We did things quite a bit differently. Get over here so I can see my own slides. We were working with providers, we call them providers in the U.S., therapists, whatever, payers, researchers in various institutions. We're developing a cloud-based system, okay, so everything was centralized in one computer. Now we have actually some really big servers doing this. There are some advantages to doing that, obviously. We're using multivariate predictive modeling and complex multivariate decision support algorithms. So that because of the power of the systems, we're able to constantly analyze data. To give you an idea, we're basically updating continuously about every 15 minutes. It's reanalyzing everything. And we're basically predicting an outcome based on intake scores, on diagnosis and so on. And then we're looking at actual results compared to predicted and so forth. So we're able to give warnings. You're off track, very much like Michael Lambert's work and so forth. The algorithms are somewhat more complex because we're also looking at suicidal ideation changes in that, substance abuse changes in that, alliance changes in that. So we're looking at actually 8 or 9 variables independent on that, given the message. One of the things we did differently was we abandoned the use of copyrighted standardized questionnaires. What we found was that many of them were too long. We wanted to measure it every session, which means it better not take more than 2 minutes. So we were crafting items that were very short, partial sentences. We have an item bank. We now have 300 plus items. Every item, we norm in every item. So we know the intake score for each item, the slope of change in therapy for each item, and the correlation with what we call the global distress factor. Now, if you've looked at as much data as I have, let me just say, good luck finding a factor for depression, a factor for anxiety, a factor for loneliness, etc. Yes, if you torture the data enough, maybe you can find it, but it's no, never mind. Essentially, we're dealing with a global distress factor. So our target is to have a questionnaires with reliability of 0.9, strong construct validity. For adults, it takes about 10 items to get there. Well-chosen items for children and adolescents, it takes more. The correlations aren't quite as strong. You can tease out an externalizing and internalizing factor, sort of. Again, you have to torture it a little bit. So the idea was to keep the questionnaire short. The other thing is to give people some flexibility. If I walk in and say, I have a wonderful questionnaire, 200 published articles, isn't this great, this is what you're going to use, they're going to look at it and go, I don't like it. You didn't ask about this, you didn't ask that. What I found was we can come in with a great questionnaire and they go, you didn't ask about bullying. Oh, okay, we'll just say bullying. That's how we got 300 items. And every item gets tested. And most of the items are good. If they're not, they fall by the wayside pretty quickly. So we have a wide range of questionnaires, variations on a theme. But basically, they're all measuring the same thing. And the way we equate stuff, they're all creating similar effect sizes and so forth. The platform is also sufficiently powerful to take in large quantities of what we call claims data, cost data, pharmacy data, where we can actually merge all this stuff together and begin to look at, for example, the cost-benefit ratio. We call it value. For every dollar you spend, how much improvement did you by. And there's a lot of variability in that, a lot. So as of last month, the total database had data for almost 11,000 therapists, 2.8 million questionnaires, a little over 900,000 cases. If I updated this today, it'd be another 50,000 questionnaires in there. I mean, a lot comes in. The question of benchmarking outcomes, because we're very interested in basically measuring performance. But if you're going to do that, you've got to have case mix adjustment. You can't just be recording raw data because it's all over the place. So we developed a methodology to that, a series of articles. We published on it with our colleague Takanami, who is one of Bruce Wampo's students and who is at now chair of his department at UMass Boston. The math got pretty complicated. I'm going to spare you on it, but basically we established benchmarks based on RCTs. Okay, what do we expect from good studies? About 0.8. Okay, close enough, about 0.8. And then we looked at results in the real world and discovered, wow, we're pretty close to 0.8. So the answer is, of course, 0.8. And as you may be aware, if we look at 40 years of RCTs, the effect sizes now are the same as they were 40 years ago. So it's like, okay, so much for, let's find the latest and greatest. The real action is with the therapist, not the treatment. The other thing we did was having a control for sample size. Because when we're comparing therapists and we're benchmarking therapists, it's a lot easier to have an effect size of, let's say, 1.2 when you have an N of 10 cases than if you have an N of 100. You're going to get regression on effects. A quick story on this. I was working at that time with a big insurance company, United Healthcare, and we were putting this in place, and they wanted to vet it with the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association. Well, the American Psychiatric Association is easy because they don't know anything about math. But Bruce Wampo was representing the American Psychological Association. And so we're laying out, we got all of this, and we're going to take the means of the therapist, and Bruce says, well, no, you can't do that. You actually have to use hierarchical linear model to account for sample size. And I'm going, Bruce, how on earth am I going to explain this to a therapist? And he's going, well, yeah, you want to do it right. This is what you got to do. So we went back, and it took us about a week to program that in too. So we used HLM to adjust for sample size. And we published articles on this, and we've established a distribution of effect size. The most recent article, and I'm going to show you the result of that very quickly, we had a sample of about 3,000 therapists where we had at least 5 cases for, and we basically said, okay, how do we equate somebody with 5 cases to somebody with 100 cases? And basically that works. Now the other thing we're interested in is, can we improve outcomes? As I've gotten fond of saying, measuring outcomes is boring. Okay, they're pretty good. 0.8 effect size. General, they're pretty good. The issue is, can we improve? Beginning in 2011, we began to track in our system how often therapists log in to look at their results and how long they stay logged in. But basically, the main metric was how often they log in. They spend an average of about 10 or 15 minutes when they log in looking at their results. So it's not a lot of time. And we divided them up into 3 groups. Now, in the whole sample we're looking at, About 40% of the therapists in any given year don't look. Another 30% looked less than 24 times, less than twice a month on average. And about 40%, 30%, I mean, looked, I get my math right, yeah, 30% looked, equivalent of twice a month or more. Okay, so we divided them into 3 groups. Now the sample size using for the study is going to be a lot smaller because the criteria was that the therapists had to have begun after we started tracking logins. So that reduced our sample size of available therapists from about 10,000 to about 4,500. They also had to have been collecting data for 3 years because we needed to give cases enough time to complete. We wanted the cases we looked at to have at least time for at least a year of therapy. So that reduced us to 853 case therapists that we could use. And then they had to have at least 5 cases in each of the first 2 years. So now we're down to 337 therapists, or about 8% of the available users. You might suspect that this is no longer representative. And you'd be right, I have a slide on that. So once we had the therapist and we said, okay, now, what cases did they see? You mean the number 14,000 plus cases, a little over 6,000 in each year. I mentioned we had published an article on basically looking at the distribution of effect size. At the top here, you see the sample size. You see that the mean, what we call severity adjusted effect size, because we're basically, if you want the details later, but trust me, it's case mix adjusted, so every case has an equal probability of a 0.8 effect size. If you don't do that, you're all over the place. It's almost impossible to interpret. So the mean is about the same, but if you look, the standard deviation is all over, so obviously the larger the sample, the tighter your distribution. By applying hierarchical linear modeling, you then see that our distribution is almost the same at each sample size. So this is what we're doing to, again, make it possible to even begin to look at this data. Let me tell you, this is computationally intensive. You don't go running this analysis unless you've got some serious horsepower to do it. Our servers, we just, 12 processors, 128 gig of RAM, we're going at it with just brute force. So here is the problem. I mentioned that maybe it's not representative. As it turns out, our sample of therapists is a lot better than the population as a whole. Here's the distribution of the grades, the distribution of the population of therapists as a whole. We have an average effect size of 0.8. Standard deviation around that is approximately 0.17. By the way, these are normalized things. You plug it into Excel, put it in your mean standard deviation, it makes these nice pictures. But it actually is very normally distributed. This is a fair picture. It's just kind of quick and dirty. What you see is our study sample had an effect size significantly above average. Now, can anybody think what the problem with this is going to be? Regression to the mean. So in year 2, they look worse. All right, this is a regression artifact. If you start off with therapists that are already at about the 75th percentile or something like that, odds are, next time you look, pure regression. But you got to account for that. So here's where we are in year 2, but we're still, have an effect size well above 0.8 in year 2. This just happens to be a particularly effective group of therapists. We're stuck with that. So, how do we do it? How do we look at this? I'm using regression here. And what you're looking at here is a regression line. So I'm using the severity adjusted effect size, the mean severity adjusted effect size in year 1 to predict where they are in year 2 as a function of how often they look. And what you see here is a threshold effect. In other words, looking not at all or looking a little bit seem to be the same. Once they got to about twice a month, and I got to say, there's some post hoc analysis going on and figuring out where the heck this is. Because if I just plug in simple correlations, it's hard to find. So for example, if I look at this group of therapists that logged in twice a month or more, and then I say, well, the more they log in, the better they are, no. It appears to be there is good enough, you look enough, looking a lot more, it doesn't matter. I wish it did. Trust me. I did torture the data some to prove my hypothesis that it did, and it doesn't. But there's a threshold effect, which is interesting, I think. So what you see here is that if you're looking, the green line is those who looked twice a month or more. In your second year, regardless of where you were in the first year, your odds are roughly 0.5, 0.6 effect size larger than those who looked less. Now, that's not a big difference. I would argue across a population of patients, that's worth something. We measure it every session, and I initially hear, oh, well, that's too much work. In our clinic, patient walks in, takes 30 seconds to hand them. We use tablets, it's electronic now. Please take a moment to complete this questionnaire. Research shows that if you do this, you're likely to get better outcomes and help you and your therapist discuss how things are going. It's important to be honest. Will you complete this? Not a problem. They'll say yes. Takes them about 60 seconds to complete the questionnaire on the tablet. As a therapist, now I had that in front of me immediately at the start of the session. I now don't have to ask about 2 minutes. Okay, suicidal ideation and so forth. We're taking it every session. This is just one quick case example. I got 2 minutes. I'm going to do it. Watch me. This is a really large practice. One of the first practices we worked with. At the time when we first started, they had about 70, 80 therapists. They now have 300 therapists in 15 locations in one city. They dominate the market, and they market their outcomes. When we first started measuring, we had an effect size right around that 0.5, 0.6 range. It just started climbing. About 2009, we started putting alliance items on every questionnaire. Looking back at your last session, we talked about what was important. Okay, they're not at the end of the session, they're there. So the therapist has at the start. When we did that, effect size jumped about 0.2, just like that. It took us no time to put them in all the questionnaires. But they keep going up. Now, I told you initially, only about 30% of the therapists will look twice a month. In this practice, we have really been working on it. And I'm fond of saying that no matter what you do, there's about 25% that are going to fight you every step of the way. Well, in this particular practice, 75% are logging in twice a month. We're at that 25% that no matter what you do, they're going to fight you every step of the way. But there's the difference in the distribution of effect size for it. Now that's just looking at 1 year. This wasn't looking to change from 1 year to the next. But there is the difference. Okay. Did I bring it in? On time and under budget, right?
If you still want to say something, I'll allow you to do that. If you have something else you wanted to say.
I'll go very quick, just an example of what you might, how can you prove your method? Let's jump over that. Here's what the tool looks like, okay? And I'm happy to pull up my own data. You can see I got a raw effect size of 1.25. I don't buy that because my cases happen to be more severe. Adjusted down to 0.99. Okay, I feel pretty good about that, but after I adjust it down for sample size and so forth, it's really about 0.88, 0.9. Here's a graph of a particular case, and you can see we're graphing suicidal ideation, self-harm, The blue line is projected change. The dotted black line is what we call a benchmark target. Basically, you hit that target and you're at a 0.8 effect size. You get below that, your effect size is larger than 0.8. So your goal is to get below that line, be 0.8. The green line there is alliance. Very quickly, what we find is that what you don't want is the alliance to be wonderful. You don't want the client telling you at every session, boy, that was perfect, could not have been better. They're not being honest. And that's not associated with a good outcome. What's associated with good outcome is the client who tells you early in treatment, it wasn't perfect, it could have been better. That's the pattern you want. So as a therapist, that means when I start treatment, I got to coach them to be honest with me and tell them that, you know, if you tell me every session is perfect, I'm going to have a hard time believing you because, one, I know I'm not perfect. I know that I can't be. And so if you're telling me everything could have been better, I'm just not going to buy it. What I'm pulling for is them to tell me early on what could have been a little bit better. I'm not sure we talked about what was important. I want to start that feedback. Okay.
Hey, thank you, Jay.
Yeah.
We'll take a couple of questions before giving speech to SIDS.
Yeah, hi, you talked about the advice that you have looking at outcomes, but is there an initial kind of set that you would give to the client and then just tailor it once you know a little bit more about them? I'm just interested in
Right.
how it kind of works in practice.
That's a wonderful idea until you try to get 10,000 therapists to do it. Simplicity. Basically, I mean, there's so many wonderful ideas that would be wonderful to implement, but in the real world, it better be something. So, no, we don't. Yes, it would be nice to do that, but that's what you need money for and study for. This is messy. These are real-world therapists who are going, I don't have time for this. Yeah, well.
Jeb, you speak about the difference between the therapists who log in 24 times or more in a 12-month period as opposed to different.
Or not.
But what about the therapists looking with the data as it's fed in by the client actually throughout the treatment process?
I don't know. I think it's a judgment call in my work, and I see a few cases still just to keep my street credibility up. Sometimes I'll look at it, show them the graph, sometimes not. It kind of depends on the case, not at every session. The interesting question is, these therapists that are logging in, what makes them different? Are they more motivated? I mean, is there something different about them? What I really want to find out, and we're trying to do a QA study with that practice of surgery where 25% just won't do it. What if we get that 25% to do it? What happens? And we're working on that. I was just there last week. I did the same talk. I showed them the graph. I said, those of you that didn't log in, would you stand up and raise your hand? Well, no, I didn't really, but I wanted to. But I'd be really curious to see if we can get them to do it. Can we bump it up? Because I don't know what they're doing. The study I would love to do is go back to these therapists saying, what are you doing? You know, and is there something that's different about it? Yeah.
Just a very quick question. It's very fascinating. You skipped a slide that I also wanted to see how to improve it, how we improve our fitness.
Oh, sure. First of all, use the questionnaires as a clinical tool. All right, don't think of them as a measure, think of them as a tool you use in the therapy. It's a communication. Every time they fill it out, there's a context. They're telling you something. So use it as a tool. Now, one of the things we've looked at is, because therapists say, oh, my patients don't like filling out questionnaires. Well, one study we did, we asked therapists to, if they refuse to fill it out, just send us in the form and say refuse. 10% of the patients refused, it came from 10% of the therapists. It's a therapist issue, not a patient issue. We have a meta questionnaire that asks patients how they feel about questionnaires. Do we ask the right things? Were you honest? Blah, blah, Was your therapist interested? That's the variable. If they thought the therapist was interested, 95% said they were helpful, 95% said they were honest, and they were much more likely to complete the alliance items. If the therapist wasn't interested, still shockingly 55% of them found it helpful. So it's very simple. If you're a therapist, when they fill it out, look at it and thank them. Let them know you appreciate the feedback. If they give you feedback on the session, like the session wasn't all that good, you compliment them on their honesty. You're the kind of person I like to work with. You're direct. I think we'll have a good result. You encourage that, you compliment. Get good at eliciting honest feedback. It's not about my ego. You have to convince them of that. Otherwise, they are nice people. I say they're lying to you. They're being polite. They're nice people. You have to help them get over that. Obviously, be flexible. Don't get attached to your favorite method of therapy. Is this therapy working for them? Be prepared to reach into your grab bag or whatever. Be flexible. I found that you have to modify your personal style. When I first started to measure my own outcomes, now therapists, as you know, have very good self-esteem. A recent article showed that the typical therapist thinks they're more effective than 80% of their peers, and none are below average. If you'd asked me, I'd have said I was better than 90% of my peers at least, because I did not lack confidence. When I started measuring myself, my effect size was about 0.6. And I was kind of stuck there until I started using alliance questionnaires, and suddenly I realized that patients were different, and I had to treat them differently. Some patients needed a lot more emotional support. They didn't know if I liked them. I had to be very explicit. What I really like about you is, another patient would have seen that as condescending and phony. So I had to adjust kind of how I presented myself. Not to mention adjusting, how I approach the therapy and so forth. A constant sort of flexibility. Seek out your results. Now, I have a hypothesis that if you want to get better, you've got to have real performance feedback. If you don't know where you are now, how are you going to know if you got better? Therapists cannot possibly judge this for themselves. It's a cognitive impossibility. Patients are all over the place. If you say, my outcomes are pretty good, they're great, you're like remembering a few cases maybe, there's no way they know. So finding out you're below average is a powerful motivator to figure out what you got to do to get better. So I think in order to get better, you've got to have performance feedback.
Yeah,
Is that-
well, thank you. Yeah, and give the stage to SAES. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay.